How about a nice round of applause for St. Clement's and their great food? I hope you enjoyed it. We've been here numerous times now, and they haven't disappointed us. So I think we're going to be frequent flyers here at the St. Clement's Castle in Portland. It's a hell of a commute for me, though. I mean, geez, you know. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed the morning program. The afternoon program is going to be equally as good and so forth. But right now we have would like to bring to the podium a presentation by Mr. David Radka, aka I call him the Professor. I've worked with David for many years, but Dave has recently joined Malone & Broom as a senior environmental specialist after working for the Connecticut Water Company for more than 30 years, and he holds a BS in biology, chemistry, and a Master's of Science in hydrology. And he's one smart feller. As Connecticut's water director to water resources and planning, David participated on numerous committees and forums with other stakeholders and policymakers, including the development of the stream flow regulations and the state water plan, where he served as the science and technical and policy subcommittee chair. He continues to be involved in the water policy issues, serving the work group tasked with implementing the state water plan and co-chair of the Connecticut Central Water Utility Coordinating Council, aka the WUC. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David L. Radka, the Professor.
Thank you, thank you, David. Before we start, I can't take credit for this idea, but my table suggested right after lunch, we all get out our crayons. We're going to do a group coloring exercise, all right? I like that table. I'm going to focus on that. So, Maureen Westbrook was actually originally tasked or asked to do this, and she got pulled away with some other responsibilities. So I'm stepping in for her. So the last slide is I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to say questions, Maureen Westbrook, and her contact information, okay? Which one? I don't want to push the wrong. Right side. There you go. All right. So this was actually the first slide that she had developed. I used some of hers and introduced some of my own. But we heard this earlier when we had an overview of the state water plan, and that's what we found through that and through the Water Utility Coordinating Committee process is that Connecticut is actually a pretty water-rich state. We do have adequate water supplies to meet our demands, but as Lori, I believe, pointed out earlier, we also realize that we don't always have it where we need it and when we need it, right? At the same time, it's also very clear that we have a history here in Connecticut of having a very strong environmental ethic. We have myriad laws, regulations, policies that really protect our water resources, and a lot of time spent talking about the state water plan. I won't go into a lot of that, but now we do have a comprehensive state water plan, obviously, that looks to drive that balance that we have in many areas, even deeper and further into every water resource management decision that we do make. Again, don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Just want to highlight, obviously, many of you were involved in the creation of this, and it was a very collaborative process. It was a consensus-built document. A lot of science is in there, as you know, a lot of policy recommendations. And again, it's really a planning tool to achieve consistent decision-making when it comes to managing those resources. And the real goal, the sort of the meta goal, if you will, is trying to find a good balance so that we can hopefully meet all our water needs, both in stream and out of stream. And what I did is I went into the plan, because this is really about conservation, and I said, how many conservation-related recommendations are there in the plan? Right? Because it's in different sections, and I pulled those out, and that's what's in the plan. A lot of effort spent talking about conservation, a lot of recommendations or ideas that are teed up for further implementation. As we talked about earlier, that implementation phase is actually just barely getting underway, very nascent at this point. Most of these and perhaps it's not a surprise to folks, relate to how we use our public water supply sources, right? So a little bit about water companies in Connecticut for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with it. There are actually 365 water companies in the state, and they operate and manage 557 community water systems. Here's where I think it starts to get interesting. 557, but when you break that down, actually under 100 of those are actually municipal systems and or public authorities, say a regional water or MDC. So the bulk of those are obviously private, but when you look further, you see that less than 25% actually serve more than 500 people. So what we have are a lot of water companies, yes, a lot of water systems, but they're small private systems, homeowners association and the like, right? And when you look at the areas served throughout the state, obviously no surprise, it's really concentrated in the most densely populated areas. But here's the takeaway, is that it's really a significant public service obligation that we have as public water companies, because almost 80% of the state's population is actually served by public water. If we look into the numbers a little bit, and this is from a USGS, I think they do every 5 years, they do an analysis of water use across the entire United States. And so when we look at the state of Connecticut, of those 557 systems, only 34 either rely solely on surface water or a mix of surface and groundwater. So again, a lot of water systems utilizing groundwater supplies, and the bulk of those, because they are so small, are those small bedrock well systems that were referred to earlier today. The average daily production, and I don't recall what calendar year this is from, but the USGS circular wasn't that old, so maybe it's 2-year-old or 3-year-old data that was reported. But the average daily production for Connecticut's public water systems is 240 million gallons a day. When you look at where that's coming from, the bulk of it, the lion's share, almost 200 million gallons of the 240 is actually coming from reservoirs, surface water systems, right? And only 43 million gallons a day is coming from a groundwater. As was mentioned earlier, states also regulate, and here my number differs from Lori. I'm giving her credit for regulating more of those small transient, non-community systems than she was taking credit for. But roughly, I think she said 2,500, but maybe 3,000 transient, non-community systems, which obviously are the restaurants, facilities like this, schools, office buildings, and the like. All in, all these water systems utilize about 4,500 sources of supply that our state health department is tasked with staying on top of and regulating. And then when you look at the private domestic well component, that adds about another 31 million gallons a day to that average daily water demand. So if you think about how in the world are we going to take all those recommendations, and probably more to come that are in the state water plan, and develop policy that can start to implement that when we have this mix and this just tremendous number of systems and utilities. How can we reach all that and apply something that will? It's obviously can't be a one size fits all. It seems fairly complex, but when you start to look at how and where our water is actually, the public water systems are actually using the greatest quantity. What I did is I went into the WUC reports. Dave mentioned the WUCs, the Water Utility Coordinating Committees, recently finalized. For the first time, the entire state went through that statewide planning process. And the data that came out of that is also about the same time frame. I want to say 2017, 16 year end. But when we look at that, you can see that of the 4 largest utilities, that would be Aquarion, the Metropolitan District Commission, the Regional Water Authority, and Connecticut Water. It's almost 90% of that 240 million gallons, right? So that's where we get the biggest bang from our buck, if we're thinking about how do we further our conservation ethic in the state when it comes to public water supply use. And what I think is also interesting is that when you look at, and we'll talk later, I'm going to focus on private water utilities and some of the regulatory mechanisms that we enjoy. When you look at that breakdown, Aquarion, Connecticut Water Company are about 50% of that roughly 200 million gallons a day. and then regional and the MDC are about the other. So it's about a 50-50 mix when you break it down. So we're going to just take a step back and look at some of the challenges that are facing water utilities. And this is from a recent report, 2017, from Barclays and Columbia University Water Center. And I think they captured it quite well. They said the biggest challenge for water utilities are forecasting demand from a growing population, planning for extreme weather events, and updating aging infrastructure. And at the same time, right, the industry has to deliver consistent and clean water to its users at an affordable rate. Right? First and foremost, the responsibility for any public water supplier is public health and safety. But if that was sort of a national assessment that was done. So what I wanted to do is go back again to those WOOC reports, which looked at every water system in the state of Connecticut. And I want to drill into what those assessments, those recent assessments identified as the challenges facing water utilities in the state of Connecticut. So the first, not surprisingly, talked about declining revenue and increasing costs, right? Some, and this is not universal, any of these that I'm going to show are not universal. They are system specific, but it affects it to a large enough degree that this was identified by the water utility coordinating committees. A trend of decreasing average day demands. Right? No surprise there. We've been talking about that for quite a while, and I'll show you a slide later that speaks to Connecticut Water Company's experience with that. But obviously with continued conservation, declining industry, housing market, blah, 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 we've been challenged then, obviously, challenged by declining revenue because of the high fixed costs of running a water system. That puts stress on and can negatively impact the levels of service and obviously makes paying for necessary infrastructure all the more challenging. Right? You may have seen this slide before, but for those who haven't, why is that? Because on average, again, this is average, 90% of utility costs are fixed. Right? That's that upper graphic. Only 10% of the costs are marginal, that are associated with the direct cost to produce and deliver that unit of water. Conversely, when you look at where the majority of utilities receive their revenue, that's really skewed toward that commodity charge. So what's actually going through the meter, right? It's about, I think this is maybe a national average or maybe through AWWA, it's about over 60% is coming, 65% is coming from that commodity charge, right? So there, it's very easy to see why there is that inherent disconnect or disincentive rather to encourage conservation, right? When you're relying so much to pay for those fixed costs on what's going through a meter. Why not have a high fixed meter charge and rely less on consumption, you ask? I heard someone ask that. And for one thing, I mean, if you think about it, that then creates a disincentive for the customer to care. I'm paying for this anyway. Why should I care how much I use? Now, water use and water rates is not a perfectly elastic thing, and folks at this table can speak volumes about it, but there is some elasticity there, and so that's why when we set rates, we do want to try to encourage things like conservation through price signaling. Another challenge that the WOOCs identified was that in some systems, we see increasing ratio of peak day demand to average day demand. Right? It's not universal across the board. I've been tracking it for well over a decade for Connecticut Water, and actually in one of our systems, it's actually going down. Others are going up. But this obviously can impact your ability to meet that peak in a way that points to, again here, it specifically says, a need to conserve during peak day conditions. And because that's often during the summer months, coincident with water-intensive irrigation and other activities, I think that's perfectly speaks to some of the presentations we had today about what we can potentially do to mitigate that impact, especially from irrigation. And one of the last general findings of all three WOOCs was that, hey, water infrastructure is aging, no surprise there. And that replacement cycles are getting longer. Again, generalization, but they're getting longer. Infrastructure is getting older, and it's more vulnerable to failure, resulting obviously in higher water losses. So when we think about those challenges that the work identified, what are the impacts? I think they're pretty self-explanatory, but obviously reduced demands. If you're relying upon that as your revenues are going down. At the same time, your fixed costs are largely remaining the same. Meanwhile, your capital investment needs are increasing, can lead to negative cash flow. That's going to can directly impact the sustainability of that water system, right? And that's where we obviously run into when we bump right up against this conflict with conservation. You know, as Dave said, I've been doing this for 30 years. A lot of friends in the business, and people want to do the right thing. Utilities want to do the right thing by and large, but that's where the sort of the rubber meets the road. When the managers especially are saying, yeah, I want to do what I can to help conserve, but I've got this balance that with my need to bring in revenue. So what I want to do is talk very quickly, very high level here about risk, because all of the challenges we talked about really potentially manifest themselves in a risk to the utility and the utility sustainability. And so how do we manage risk? I mean, this is just sort of universally, when we think about risk, we always start with the inherent risk, right? What's the likelihood of something occurring, and what's the impact on our operations if it were to happen, right? Then we think about what are the controls that we can apply, right? And how do we do that to mitigate either the occurrence or the impact or the outcome? And what you're left with is the residual risk, okay? So when we think of one of the controls that we can to help mitigate some of these risks, it's about how we price it, right? How do we price water? And overall, when you think about pricing water, these are the things that you really want to think about accomplishing sort of at the big picture level, right? We really want to reflect the true value of water. There's a big push through AWWA a number of years ago to get utilities to do that, because across the country it was undervalued, devalued. So that was one big message that they had. We also want to make sure that we're getting that revenue requirement in that we need for operating and capital costs. But we need to balance that, you know, with the customer's rates and the impact to the customer, you know, with that need to sustain the system, so that obviously we can meet the current and future system needs. Now, how we then develop those rates really depends upon more specific objectives that one wishes to design around, right? If you're looking to support economic development, you can have declining block rates, right, and different rate classes. In fact, folks may not recall this, but back in the 80s, the governor said to the bigger utilities, you shall go adopt economic development rates that had a lower block rate to try to encourage development. And some of those, I think, are still on the books. If you're looking to accelerate infrastructure replacement, and I will talk about this, you can design your rate structure in a way that allows for interim rate adjustments and or surcharges to be put on to help incentivize that. If we're talking about, let's figure out what we can do to promote conservation, maybe you want to look at increasing block rates so the unit cost per volume of water used goes up as you use more water. Or seasonal rates are certainly an option, or decoupling, which I'll also talk about later. We're always sensitive to the impact on municipalities, especially because of the fire protection charge can be significant, and so we always are looking ways to hopefully minimize that. And then affordability, right? It's something that we all have to be cognizant of and sensitive to. And how do we set rates that do all the things we're talking about, but at the same time don't unnecessarily burden the people who really can't afford it, because it's such a, because it's such a life-affirming need that everyone has. So the first thing I do want to talk about is the infrastructure replacement legislation, and this is, again, really in order to accelerate that infrastructure replacement cycle. So in 2007, the legislature authorized an interim rate adjustment mechanism for private utilities. So this is for PURA-regulated utilities. This, as I said, is a surcharge to recover that cost, and you must meet a certain test. The pipe that you're replacing has to be contributing to unacceptable levels of lost water, or negatively impacting water quality or reliability, primarily. It is subject to PURA approval, so you go to them prior to, you say, this is what I would like to do in the coming year. Once you've completed that replacement, you go back to them and say, here's what I did. If the job's complete, they review all of that, and then and only then are you allowed to collect or add that surcharge to your customers' rates to help pay for that cost. Connecticut Water Company in 2016, we actually replaced our 100th mile of water main under this program. So it's been a very successful program. The average age of the pipe that we've replaced has been about 75 years. And that's probably on the low side because a lot of what we targeted were smaller, undersized mains and a lot of acquired systems. So they weren't necessarily the older pipes, but they were the ones that were contributing to quality or reliability problems or service problems. It's represented about a $150 million investment over that period of time that we've been utilizing it. And the benefit, obviously, to conservation is that it's obviously conserving resources by reducing the frequency of breaks or even existing water loss through older pipe with weeps and leaks in those joints. It's enhancing water quality and fire protection. Many times you're upsizing the main and you're improving or even for the first time introducing fire protection to an area. And it obviously ensures that water systems were going to be able to be sustainable and serve future generations. Very successful program, as I said. Most private utilities in the state now are utilizing or have a WICA program in place. The water revenue adjustment mechanism I want to talk about next, and this is in 2013, the legislature authorized was probably even a more progressive rate adjustment mechanism. And this really was the decoupling that I was talking about to remove the disincentive for conserving water. And that allows for periodic or annual rate adjustments or surcharges to recover that allowed revenue if you don't actually realize it in the prior calendar year, right? It could be a surcharge if you actually collected more, but the important thing is the customer is protected through this process. And that's been a very successful program. That I'll also talk about quickly. So because these were the things we were doing before we had things like the water revenue adjustment mechanism, and we still do them today. You know, bill inserts, it's really communicating with your customers about how they can conserve, right? Either through reaching out to them more recently through websites, social media, direct mailings, water conservation calculators. We link to AWE's calculator on our website. If you have a high bill, we send you note. These are the things that most utilities are doing. But what we've been able to do, what we've started to do since we have the water revenue adjustment mechanism is we actually went out to our municipalities and said, if we're serving your municipal building, we want to come in and do a water audit of all of your fixtures. And if we find something that's subpar, it's not up to today's standards, we're going to replace it for you free of charge. So when you talked about that net blue offset program, that's essentially what we were doing. We didn't have any targets, but we were doing a very similar thing. And a number of our communities took advantage of it. We went in, and what we largely found were the toilets. That's largely what we replaced were toilets. We also initiated something we call the Water Drop Challenge, where we reached out to our customers and said, you know what, we're going to challenge you to use less water this year than you did last year. And if you can do that, we're going to give you a credit on your first bill of the next year. And we had 5,000 customers sign up for it, and about 40% of those actually achieved the goal. And what we did is we encouraged them, or we asked them to give us contact information, email addresses, and we kept pushing out conservation notices that were timed to that season or time of the year. Here's what you can do, and partway through we actually even sent them, maybe twice we sent them a reminder or a notice saying, here's where you are. You're there, you're ahead of the goal, or you're not quite there. You can do it. We try to encourage people to really be successful. And in the end, we actually saved, those customers alone, saved about 30 million gallons over that period of time. And then what we did after that, we said, you know what we really want to do is get out into the communities and the schools and talk to kids about it, because that's really where we need to distill and drill down a new conservation ethic. So we developed a program to teach kids that would align with the third grade curriculum around the water cycle. And we did that with Pomperaug River Watershed Coalition. They helped us develop this. We trained our employees to do it, and we asked towns, schools that we serve, we're offering this, we're willing to do it, come let us in. And it was a tremendous success. We did it 1 year. We kept getting called back. Can you come back to our school? Can you do it? So we're doing it now annually, and so far we've actually reached out to over 2,500 kids that we've taught. And we teach them about the water cycle. We teach them about water conservation. They come up with ideas on how they can conserve water. They take a pledge. They take it home. It's been a really great experience. And I just want to show you a graphic from this water drop challenge that we did, because after we've concluded it, I thought, you know what? I want to show people a way that we can show them, what did those customers actually save? What's kind of a neat way to represent that? And so I calculated, that quantity, and what if you took our average water tanker and you stacked them end to end? It would actually reach from our headquarters in Clinton up to the University of Connecticut. That's how much water in that 1 year that small group of customers was able to save. Now, I said I'd show you a graphic on declining consumption, because when we talk about it, here's where Connecticut Water Company is actually at. And there's a couple things I think are interesting about this slide, because there's been a long-held rule of thumb in the state of Connecticut that the average residential customer uses about 18,000 gallons per quarter. And you can see that our average now is actually down around 14,000 gallons per quarter. All right? This is across the board. Can't tell you how many residential customers, but if we have close to 100,000 customers, it's the lion's share of that. It's well over 60%. So if we're down around 14,000 gallons per day, that's about 1.3 billion gallons of water a year that our residential customers are not using, that they the historic residential use might have otherwise been. Can't tell you exactly why we're achieving that. Some of it's fixtures. It's sort of that just ongoing decline because we're becoming more efficient as people go out and retrofit their homes and so on. I'd like to think some of that is because of the messaging and the work we've been doing to reach out to customers to try to encourage them to save. But the other point I want to make is and here's where it's important about when you're setting rates, is to be cognizant of this and to be knowledgeable about what that projected actual use may be, because that would actually represent, if the expectation was for Connecticut Water Company that we would be selling 18,000 gallons per quarter per customer, that would end up being about a $10 million a year loss in revenue to the company. All right, so there and creates another disincentive for people to achieve conservation. And lastly, I want to say that as we look forward to implementing the state water plan and the WUCs have their own implementation challenges also. Here's what I've learned over the last 30 years. And it really started to turn around this collaboration, I'll call it here, when the Water Planning Council was formed, because it threw a lot of us different stakeholders together, whereas before we talked over one another, we talked around one another, we talked at each other through the legislative process, but we never really were always in the same room trying to work on our problems together. And that really started in the early 2000s with the Water Planning Council, as I said, when we had a large number of stakeholder groups working on a number of initiatives that were identified by the legislature back then. It carried forward. There's been hiccups along the way, make no doubt. But with the stream flow regulations, we had to take a couple runs at it, but we got there. As you heard, there was acceleration yesterday that all of the state's waters are classified now. And then lastly, with the state water plan, a lot of collaborative work went into that. And so as we move forward to implement all of these things, it's only going to happen if we continue to collaborate. It's only going to happen if we continue to sit down and have the dialogue that we've been having. And work collaboratively, obviously, and to try to achieve that balance, continue to achieve that balance that the state water plan really, I wouldn't say mandates, but certainly encourages us to try to do whenever and wherever possible. And lastly, and I'm reading this now, and this is not a dig at the public trust in the state water, but it really does take trust. We really have to continue to build on and nurture the trust that we've been able to develop over this time. And as I said, yes, any questions, go to Maureen Westbrook. So, thank you.